Something a little bit different on Book Break today, we are going to talk about podcasts. So I've been talking to the whole team, getting their recommendations, and here is a list of all the podcasts that we have been loving and think you might too. And just because I'm here at Strathmore Publishing, it's really exciting to mention that this is actually the studio where we recorded some of Laura Thomas's podcasts, Don't Salt My Game. Laura Thomas is amazing. I'm sure you already follow her on Instagram. She is the author of Just Eat It, which is a book all about intuitive eating and ditching diet culture forever. So I'll put a link below so you can listen to some of that. It's all at the end of her book's audiobook as well. So I've been having a lot of fun exploring the control room in here, but I'm now going to go through to the other side of the glass to the live room and tell you about all the podcasts that we think you'll love. So I am in the reader's chair now. This feels very exciting and professional. But on with the podcasts. So one of the biggest genres of podcasts is true crime. The whole podcast scene really exploded with Serial, so it's no surprise it's such a big genre. It's really hard to pick out the best, but here are just 3 of my favourites. So let's start with one of the biggest stories of the last few years, which you will know all about if you've listened to the podcast The Dropout, which tells the story of Elizabeth Holmes, the founder and CEO of Theranos, the health tech company that collapsed after it was found to have committed massive fraud. The story was unbelievable, and people were particularly fascinated by Elizabeth Holmes herself. This Stanford dropout who founded the company at only 19 years old, was on track to be the next female Bill Gates, but was then discovered to have lied about basically everything, from the extent of Theranos' blood testing technology to, some people think, even her very distinctive low voice. And the story has been absolutely everywhere. So John Carreyrou was the reporter who first broke the story, and he wrote a whole book about it called Bad Blood, which is set to be adapted into a film. There's an HBO documentary about it called The Inventor, and The Dropout is a 6-part podcast that tells the story and is absolutely gripping stuff. And another story that's been absolutely everywhere is Dirty John. So there's the podcast Dirty John, there is a book that was then made called Dirty John and Other Stories, all stories from the original reporter who reported the Dirty John story, and most recently there was a Netflix show. So this is the story of con man John Meehan, who met Deborah Newell on a dating site and seemed much too good to be true because he was. So she slowly starts to uncover the extent of his lies and quite how creepy and manipulative it is. It's a really scary story and ends on a proper action sequence. And then for a bigger range of true crime stories, They Walk Among Us focuses on a different crime case in every episode, but particularly focuses on crime in the UK. So I first discovered the podcast after I was reading about Jeremy Bamber, who one night in 1985 allegedly murdered his adoptive parents, sister and nephews all at their farmhouse in Essex. And there was a whole book about this called The Murders at White House Farm, which is really interesting because the whole time Jeremy Bamber has maintained his innocence, but the rest of the extended family are convinced that he did it. So the book is this quite fair investigation of everything that we know did happen, and then They Walk Among Us did an episode about the case. But that's just one episode. They Walk Among Us is now on its 4th season, so there are so many creepy and fascinating stories to discover there. So onto my next genre. Something I didn't realise until quite recently is that podcasts don't have to be strictly non-fiction. They can also tell stories and really start to kind of blur the lines between podcasts and audiobooks. So for example, the podcast Lore. So this one is actually non-fiction, but a lot of the stories in it are folklore. And the narrator who hosts the podcast, Aaron Mankey, said that these stories are factual in the sense that people reported them and believed they were true. And again, each episode tells a different story, and they're all these really creepy and fantastical stories that you're not quite sure whether or not to believe, which is why I've put it in this genre of kind of blurring the lines between fact and fiction, even though it is technically a non-fiction podcast. And it reminded me of books like Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi, which is this fairy tale retelling, which again blurs the lines of what you are and aren't supposed to believe, and I love that style in a novel, so it's really fun in a podcast. And then of course you have flat out fiction. So one of the most famous examples is Welcome to Night Vale, which is this fictional radio show about weird happenings from a town called Night Vale. And the same creator went on to produce a podcast called Alice Isn't Dead, which is a series of fictional diaries from the perspective of a truck driver road tripping across America in search of her missing wife, who for a long time she had thought was dead. And again, it's sort of creepy, part sci-fi, part thriller. It has been adapted into a novel, which I haven't read yet, but actually listening to it, I got kind of Lovecraft Country vibes, which is a book, again, about a road trip across America uncovering along the way horrors both supernatural and real. So fans of that will love Alice Isn't Dead. So then on to my next genre. Something else that podcasts are great for is inspiration, teaching us stuff and making us feel like we're becoming better people. So a great one for that is the Success Monologues. So this is hosted by Molly Flatt, who's the author of the novel The Charmed Life of Alex Moore, which is this really unusual book about a woman who wakes up one morning and finds that everything in life is suddenly going her way, until she uncovers this massive conspiracy which explains why her luck has so suddenly changed. So now the author has this podcast, The Success Monologues, where she talks to real life women who really have achieved amazing inspirational things. So it's really, really motivation. And so leading on from that, one of my favourite educational podcasts is You Are Not So Smart, which is all about uncovering our misconceptions about the world. And it's quite shocking how wrong we are about so much, both about the world around us and about ourselves and how our brains work. And there was a really interesting episode quite early on in the podcast with Clive Thompson. So he's the author most recently of the book Coders. So he's obviously an expert on technology and how it affects us. And he was saying in the podcast that actually technology isn't making us less clever. So that was very reassuring. And finally, my final genre is podcasts that are just about books. And there are so many of these. But just to pick out, very hard to do, but just to pick out a few of our favourites, let's start with Backlisted, which is a podcast all about older books. So you're discovering some really good hidden gems instead of always just the newest, most exciting books. I found this great book focuses on underrepresented authors. So again, you'll find some hidden gems in there that you might not have heard of otherwise. And the host has a particular interest in black mystery authors. Next, a podcast with a name that all book lovers will fall in love with, Better Than the Movie. And despite the name, the podcast isn't actually exclusively about books that were turned into films. The main focus is actually books by black authors, but also bookish news, controversies, prizes. They haven't uploaded anything for about a year, but there's a really great long backlist for you to work your way through. And finally, the last I'm going to talk about is You're Booked, which is basically think Desert Island Discs, but for books. So the host, Daisy Buchanan, goes to her favourite authors' bookshelves and noses around and basically asks them to tell their life story through their journey with books, which any book lover like me will agree is the best way to get to know someone. So give this video a thumbs up if we mentioned your favourite podcast, and please do leave a comment below recommending some of your favourites. I would love to hear more that I should be listening to. And of course, do hit that subscribe button below for new videos every Thursday. Coming up next week, we have a very special guest who's going to tell us all about his favourite Caribbean literature, so that's going to be a great one. And of course, while you're waiting, you can always go and follow us over on Instagram at BookBreakUK for all of our fun behind the scenes content. See you next time!